They weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were mothers, daughters, and neighbors, women who lived ordinary lives. But behind their smiles, each carried a darkness that would erupt in crimes so shocking they would leave entire communities in disbelief. This documentary brings together three disturbing stories. Crimes that proved evil doesn't always come from the places we expect. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight, in the face of someone who looks just like us. First, we step into the life of Emilia Carr, a young woman tangled in a deadly love triangle where jealousy and betrayal fueled a brutal murder. She wasn't a stranger to love, but when passion turned into obsession, it led her to an irreversible decision, a crime carried out in cold blood, proving how dangerous a broken heart can be. Then comes Katrina Marie Culberson. Her story is one of toxic relationships and dangerous obsession. When the man she wanted slipped away, she decided that if she couldn't have him, no one could. What followed was a vicious act of violence, leaving behind a trail of pain and a reminder that love, when poisoned, can destroy everything in its path. But perhaps the most horrifying is the case of Julie Corey. A woman so desperate to prove she was pregnant, she committed an unthinkable act. She befriended a vulnerable young mother-to-be, gained her trust, and then committed a crime beyond imagination, stealing not just a life, but a child from the womb. It was an act that horrified the nation and cemented Corey's place in the history of America's most disturbing female criminals. These are not just stories of crime. They are warnings. Proof that love, when twisted by jealousy, obsession, or desperation, can transform ordinary women into killers. Welcome to a journey into the darkest side of human nature, where love itself became the weapon. Emilia Lily Carr was born and raised in Florida, in a small community that offered the image of a quiet southern life. But behind this exterior, her childhood was far from stable. Emilia grew up in a household where family bonds were often fractured, and the sense of security most children expect was missing. Accounts from those who knew her describe a girl who often appeared lost, struggling to find where she truly belonged. Her family background played a central role in shaping her early years. The Carr family had its own problems, and Emilia often found herself caught in the middle of tension and instability. Unlike many children who could rely on consistent parental guidance, Emilia was exposed to a fractured environment. This lack of stability created emotional gaps that would later influence her choices and the relationships she pursued. She was described as someone who longed for affection and validation, yet rarely found it in healthy ways. As she moved into her teenage years, the cracks in her foundation became more visible. Emilia struggled to fit in at school, and her relationships with peers were marked by insecurity. She lacked a strong support system, and instead of building confidence, she carried forward the same instability that had defined her childhood. Seeking love and attention, she entered relationships at an early age, often with older men. This pursuit was not rooted in maturity, but in her need for belonging and affirmation, something she had been searching for since childhood. By her late teens, Emilia had already experienced the challenges of early motherhood. Becoming a mother at a young age added responsibility to her life, but it did not resolve the deeper issues she carried. Instead, it made her more vulnerable. She wanted to be loved, to create the family structure she never had. But the weight of her own emotional struggles made it difficult for her to achieve stability. Her choices in partners often reflected her desperation for attachment rather than careful judgment. Those around Emilia noticed a pattern. She was quick to fall deeply into relationships, and just as quick to display intense emotions when she felt threatened. Her self-worth was tied to the people she was involved with, and jealousy or fear of abandonment became recurring themes. The more she chased security, the further it seemed to slip away. What could have been normal, youthful mistakes became amplified by her fragile emotional state. Emilia's early life shows a clear pattern of instability shaping her behavior. From a fractured childhood to troubled teenage years, she carried forward insecurity, jealousy, and an ongoing struggle to feel loved. This foundation set the stage for the dangerous path she would eventually follow. The question that remained was how these personal struggles, rooted in her earliest experiences, would turn into an obsession capable of driving her towards an unthinkable act. By the time Emilia Lily Carr entered her 20s, her personal life was already entangled in complications. One of the most defining relationships of her life was with Joshua Fulgham, a man who would play a central role in the events that followed. Their relationship was intense and volatile, marked by both passion and instability. For Emilia, Joshua represented a chance at the security and affection she had always been searching for. But this attachment soon developed into something far more dangerous. The complication came in the form of another woman, Heather Strong. Heather was not just any rival for Emilia. She was Joshua's girlfriend and the mother of his children. When Heather became pregnant, the dynamic between all three of them shifted dramatically. To Heather, Joshua was supposed to be her partner and father to her child. To Emilia, however, Heather was an obstacle, someone standing directly in the way of the family life she wanted to create with Joshua. The tension between Emilia and Heather quickly escalated. Both women saw themselves as central in Joshua's life, but his divided loyalties fueled constant conflict. There were custody disputes, heated arguments, and ongoing battles over his attention. Neighbors and friends later recalled the open hostility between the two women, which only worsened as the pregnancy advanced. For Emilia, the situation cut deeper than rivalry. She viewed Heather not just as competition, but as someone who was actively destroying her chance at stability and love. Joshua's role in this triangle added further complexity. Instead of providing clarity, he often played both sides. He maintained his relationship with Heather while continuing his involvement with Emilia. This indecision gave Emilia hope that Joshua might ultimately choose her, while at the same time deepening her resentment toward Heather. The toxic cycle of promises, betrayals, and jealousy created a situation that was spiraling out of control. Emilia's personality made her particularly vulnerable to this spiral. Already insecure from her troubled upbringing, she latched onto Joshua as the solution to her need for affection. When she sensed that Heather threatened this bond, her emotions turned into obsession. Witnesses later testified that she spoke bitterly of Heather, often describing her as a problem that needed to be removed. These words revealed more than jealousy. They signaled a dangerous mindset forming beneath the surface. At the same time, Emilia knew how to manipulate Joshua. She presented herself as the one who truly understood him, the one who could provide loyalty and support that Heather never could. She fed into his frustrations with Heather, portraying herself as the better partner. Over time, this manipulation increased Joshua's dependence on her and gave Emilia more influence over his thoughts and decisions. In her mind, the only thing standing between her and the life she wanted was Heather Strong. The tension reached a point where arguments and custody battles were no longer enough to satisfy Emilia's determination. She began to consider a permanent solution. The idea of eliminating Heather was not a sudden thought, but one that developed over time, nurtured by jealousy, desperation, and the toxic dynamic she shared with Joshua. By convincing herself that Heather was the barrier to her future, Emilia allowed her emotions to evolve into a deadly plan. From emotional turmoil, Carr stepped into the darkest stage of her life, the murder plot that would shock Florida and place her name among the few women condemned to death for their crimes. In early 2009, the tensions between Emilia Lily Carr, Joshua Fulgham, and Heather Strong reached their breaking point. The conflicts that had been brewing for months finally pushed Emilia into taking action. On February 15, 2009, Heather Strong disappeared. At first, it seemed like a domestic dispute had escalated. But as the hours passed, concern grew. Friends and family immediately knew something was wrong because Heather had 2 small children she would never willingly leave behind. Behind the scenes, Emilia Carr had already carried out the crime that would later make national headlines. Using her influence over both Joshua and her close circle, she lured Heather into a situation from which she would not return. According to case records, Emilia played an active role in bringing Heather to a trailer near Boardman, Florida. It was here that the final confrontation took place. Heather was restrained, held against her will, and ultimately suffocated. Reports detail that Heather was bound with duct tape and confined, with Emilia directly involved in the suffocation that ended her life. Emilia did not act alone. She had a co-defendant, a friend named Erica, who was part of the plan and assisted in the crime. Together, they orchestrated Heather's confinement and played roles in her eventual death. The involvement of others in this crime added to the brutality of the act, showing that this was not an impulsive attack, but a deliberate plan carried out with disturbing precision. The motive was clear. Emilia wanted Heather gone so she could secure her future with Joshua without any competition. In the days following Heather's disappearance, the community became deeply concerned. Heather was reported missing, and the authorities quickly launched an investigation. Detectives began interviewing friends, family, and associates to establish her last known movements. Joshua Fulgham and Emilia Carr were both questioned early in the investigation. Their connection to Heather made them natural suspects, and the inconsistencies in their stories raised suspicion almost immediately. As the investigation progressed, more troubling details came to light. Phone records, witness statements, and the timeline of events all began to point toward Emilia. Detectives noticed that her accounts of the days surrounding Heather's disappearance kept changing. At first, she distanced herself from the situation, suggesting she had no involvement. Later, under pressure, she admitted to being present but tried to minimize her role. These shifting stories only deepened investigators' belief that she had played a central part in Heather's death. The breakthrough came when police gathered enough evidence to confront Emilia more directly. They learned of her influence over Joshua and uncovered testimony that placed her at the scene of the crime. Forensic evidence tied the location of Heather's disappearance to individuals close to Emilia. The net was tightening, and investigators pressed harder. During interrogations, Emilia revealed her conflicting emotions. On one hand, she tried to shift blame toward others, claiming she was not the mastermind. On the other, she admitted details that only someone directly involved could have known. Detectives described her as evasive, manipulative, and inconsistent. At times, she showed indifference, while at other moments she tried to appeal for sympathy. Her behavior reflected the instability she had displayed throughout her life, now magnified in the context of a murder investigation. Eventually, the evidence was overwhelming. The inconsistencies in her statements, combined with the testimony of those who knew about the plot, made it clear that Emilia Carr had been a driving force in Heather Strong's death. The case no longer centered on whether Heather had been murdered. It was clear she had, but rather on proving Emilia's direct involvement and securing justice for the victim. By late February 2009, both Emilia and Joshua were arrested and charged in connection with the murder. The arrests shocked the small Florida community, bringing an end to weeks of speculation and fear. What began as a love triangle fueled by jealousy had now turned into a criminal case involving kidnapping, suffocation, and conspiracy to commit murder. But Emilia's battle didn't end with the crime. It had just begun in the courtroom, where the full weight of the evidence would be laid bare, and the question of her punishment would dominate the proceedings. The trial of Emilia Lily Carr drew widespread attention in Florida. Prosecutors laid out a case that showed not only the brutality of Heather Strong's murder, but also the deliberate planning that went into it. They presented evidence of Emilia's jealousy, her manipulative relationship with Joshua Fulgham, and the chilling details of Heather's confinement and suffocation. Testimony from investigators and witnesses highlighted Emilia's shifting stories and her attempts to minimize her role, contrasting sharply with the evidence that placed her at the center of the crime. The defense attempted to portray Emilia as a troubled woman who had been influenced by Joshua and others around her. They suggested that she was not the mastermind, but a participant caught in circumstances beyond her control. They emphasized her unstable childhood, her emotional fragility, and her role as a mother to argue against the harshest penalties. But the prosecution countered effectively, painting Emilia as a manipulative and willing killer who viewed Heather Strong as an obstacle to be eliminated. Throughout the proceedings, jurors noted Emilia's demeanor. Reports described her as cold and detached, showing little visible remorse for Heather's death. This lack of empathy left a deep impression on the jury, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that she had been driven by obsession rather than desperation. In 2011, the verdict was delivered. Emilia Carr was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge agreed, sentencing her to death. This outcome placed her among a very small group, women on Florida's death row. The rarity of such a sentence against a female defendant only heightened the public's interest in the case, as it challenged the perception that capital punishment was almost exclusively applied to men. Over time, Emilia's legal situation changed. Appeals and reviews led to her sentence being reduced from death to life in prison without parole. While this spared her from execution, it ensured that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The case left a strong impression on the public and the media. Many were struck by the calculated nature of the crime, the young age of the defendant, and the destructive power of jealousy that had driven the events. For a community unaccustomed to such brutality, the case stood as a disturbing reminder of how personal obsession could escalate into murder. Emilia Lily Carr's story is remembered not only because of the crime itself, but also because it highlighted the extreme consequences of unchecked jealousy and emotional instability. She remains a stark example of how destructive obsession can become when it crosses the line into violence. Katrina Marie Culberson's story begins in the quiet surroundings of North Carolina, a place where neighbors often knew one another and small-town life created the impression of stability. For Katrina, however, the foundation of her life was far from steady. Accounts of her background suggest that her early years were marked by instability, both within her family and in her relationships with others. Those who knew her described a woman whose emotions could change quickly, often leading to conflict and volatility that would eventually define her adult years. Growing up, Katrina did not enjoy the kind of secure and nurturing environment that many children rely on to build healthy emotional foundations. Instead, she struggled with strained family ties that left her searching for belonging. By the time she entered her teenage years, she carried with her patterns of behavior shaped by insecurity and an inability to manage her temper. Those traits followed her into adulthood, affecting not only her relationships, but also the way she approached the responsibilities of raising a family. As a young adult, Katrina's challenges became more visible. People who interacted with her often noticed her fiery temperament and difficulty in resolving conflict calmly. Arguments could escalate quickly, and she developed a reputation for being combative when she felt slighted or challenged. This volatility made it difficult for her to maintain stability in relationships, a pattern that would continue to shadow her life. Despite these struggles, Katrina also took on the role of motherhood. Raising children was both a source of pride and a significant pressure for her. Like many young mothers, she faced the daily challenges of providing care, structure, and love, while balancing her own emotional instability. The demands of parenting, combined with her struggles to control her temper, often created tension in her household. Those close to her would later recall that the stresses of family life seemed to weigh heavily on her, and at times she appeared overwhelmed by the responsibility. Her search for companionship and stability eventually led her into a relationship that would become central to her story. Rather than finding balance and support, however, this relationship deepened the chaos in her life. Friends and acquaintances would later describe it as toxic, full of arguments, accusations, and turbulence. The volatility that had always been part of Katrina's personality collided with the dysfunction of her partner, setting the stage for a cycle of conflict that neither side seemed able to escape. By the time Katrina reached her late 20s, the image of a small-town mother striving for normalcy had shifted into a far more troubling reality. The pressures of motherhood, unresolved personal struggles, and a destructive relationship created a combustible mix. For those around her, the warning signs of instability were clear, but few could have predicted the tragedy that was about to unfold. How did a young mother's life unravel into deadly violence? That answer begins with the unraveling of her relationship. A bond defined less by love than by conflict, and one that would ultimately end in bloodshed. By the time Katrina Marie Culberson entered her relationship with her boyfriend, the man who would later become her victim, instability had already been stitched into the fabric of her life. What might have started with ordinary companionship soon spiraled into a toxic pattern that friends, neighbors, and family members could not ignore. Their union was defined by cycles of affection, followed by volatility, arguments, and, in time, violence. People who knew them recalled that arguments were almost constant. It was not unusual for neighbors to hear raised voices coming from inside the home. One moment the couple might be speaking calmly, and the next, the conversation would erupt into shouting. Witnesses described a push and pull between them. Katrina often appeared demanding and controlling, while her boyfriend pushed back, unwilling to accept her outbursts. This created a dynamic in which neither party was willing to back down, and tensions escalated until they dominated their daily lives. Friends of the couple later said that what made their fight so concerning was Katrina's emotional volatility. She struggled to manage her temper, and when arguments flared, she often reacted impulsively. While some conflicts might have ended with slammed doors or prolonged silences, others grew more heated. She could shift quickly from tears to rage, and this unpredictability left those around her unsettled. To outsiders, it seemed that both individuals were caught in a cycle they could not break. A toxic bond held together as much by conflict as by any sense of love. Inside the home, this instability carried into the routines of daily life. Efforts to create a stable family environment were undermined by constant tension. The children in the household were exposed to the disputes, adding another layer of pressure. For Katrina, motherhood brought both pride and stress, but her inability to control her anger made maintaining peace in the household nearly impossible. Witnesses remembered that she often appeared overwhelmed, sometimes exhausted, yet her temper would flare again and undo any brief calm. In the weeks leading up to the crime, their disputes seemed to intensify. Friends described Katrina as increasingly frustrated, as if the pressure of her life was building to a breaking point. She spoke of feeling unsupported, of being under strain, and of struggling with her boyfriend's resistance to her demands. Meanwhile, others noted that her boyfriend appeared tired of the constant conflict. He confided in some that he was unhappy with the relationship and uncertain of the future, though he continued to stay in the home. It was during this period that the most alarming signs of dysfunction appeared. Their arguments became louder, more frequent, and more visible to outsiders. Some who lived nearby admitted they wondered how long the situation could continue without a serious incident. Katrina's inability to de-escalate, paired with her boyfriend's refusal to concede ground, meant that every disagreement carried the potential to spiral out of control. On the night of the crime, all of these unresolved tensions converged. What began like any other evening between a troubled couple would soon escalate into an irreversible tragedy. In the hours before, the atmosphere was already heavy with unease. Katrina's frustrations, her emotional instability, and the ongoing cycle of conflict had reached their peak. For Katrina, the desire for family stability and the inability to manage her rage collided in one devastating moment. She wanted control, she wanted peace, yet the tools she turned to were destructive rather than healing. In the end, the fight between them was not just another argument. It became the breaking point, the moment when anger crossed the line into deadly violence. The night that would change everything forever was about to unfold. The year was 2018, and tensions inside Katrina Culberson's home in North Carolina had been building for weeks. Arguments between her and her boyfriend, 32-year-old Patrick Crawford, were no secret. Friends and neighbors had overheard raised voices, sharp insults, and the kind of volatile back and forth that hinted at a relationship spiraling out of control. For Katrina, already known for her temper and emotional volatility, the stress of family life, personal insecurities, and constant fighting had created an explosive environment. On one fateful night, that pressure erupted in the most tragic way possible. The evening began like many others, with an argument. Accounts later pieced together by investigators suggest that the fight escalated quickly. Words turned into shouting, shouting turned into threats. And in a house where their young child was also present, emotions were running dangerously high. Neighbors would later testify that they heard yelling from inside the home, not an unusual occurrence, but this time more intense, more desperate. At some point in the middle of this chaos, Katrina reached for a firearm. The argument did not stop. It only grew louder. Then, in a split-second decision, fueled by rage and desperation, Katrina pulled the trigger. Patrick Crawford was shot in the presence of their child, a horrifying detail that would shock even seasoned investigators. For the little one, the image of violence unfolding before their eyes would become a lifelong trauma. For Katrina, that single act shattered the life she had known, leaving only irreversible consequences. The moments after the gunshot were filled with panic and disbelief. According to reports, Katrina did not attempt to flee the scene immediately. Instead, she was described as erratic, at times emotional, at times detached, as if still trying to process what she had done. The child's presence added another haunting layer to the crime. with witnesses later recalling how quickly the authorities were called. When law enforcement arrived, they found Patrick gravely wounded. Attempts to save him were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The scene was chaotic. Officers, paramedics, neighbors watching from a distance. But what struck investigators most was Katrina's demeanor. Some described her as distraught, others as shockingly calm, as though she shifted between moments of guilt and moments of justification. The investigation began immediately. Detectives spoke with neighbors who confirmed the constant turmoil between Katrina and Patrick. They collected physical evidence from the home, the weapon used in the shooting, blood samples, and the child's traumatized statements. Every detail pointed toward a domestic dispute turned deadly. When questioned, Katrina's explanations varied. At times, she framed the shooting as self-defense, claiming Patrick had been threatening and controlling. Other times, her story shifted into blame and anger, painting herself as the victim of years of emotional strain. But the physical evidence told a different story. Ballistics, witness accounts, and the sequence of events suggested that Patrick had not been armed. Nor had he posed an immediate lethal threat at the time of the shooting. Police reports indicate that Katrina's inconsistencies only deepened suspicions. It became clear to investigators that this was not an accident and not a clear-cut case of self-defense. Rather, it appeared to be a moment of emotional rage that escalated into a fatal act of violence. Katrina was taken into custody soon after. The charges filed against her included first-degree murder, with prosecutors highlighting the severity of committing such an act in front of her child. The very detail that made this crime so shocking, the child's presence, would later play a major role in court, shaping the way jurors and the public viewed Katrina's actions. By the end of the night, a man was dead. A child had lost both parents, one to death and one to prison. And a small North Carolina community was left reeling from the brutality of the crime. The shooting was not just another domestic dispute gone wrong. It became a grim reminder of how unchecked anger, toxic relationships, and emotional instability can culminate in irreversible tragedy. But for Katrina Culberson, the story was far from over. The courtroom would soon become the stage where her every action, every inconsistency, and every motive would be dissected in front of a jury. And it was there that the truth about that night and her fate would ultimately be decided. Transition. The tragedy didn't end at the crime scene. The courtroom would expose every detail of what happened that night. The courtroom in North Carolina became the stage where the full tragedy of Katrina Culberson's actions unfolded. Prosecutors presented their case with sharp focus, arguing that this was not a sudden accident, but a deliberate act of violence. They emphasized the timeline, the heated argument, Katrina retrieving the gun and pulling the trigger while her young child looked on. Witnesses described the chaos of that night, and the forensic evidence confirmed what the prosecution called an intentional, irreversible choice. The defense, however, painted a different picture. Katrina's attorneys argued that she had been pushed beyond her emotional limits. They spoke of her volatile relationship with her boyfriend, her struggles as a mother, and her fragile state of mind. Their argument leaned heavily on the idea that Katrina was overwhelmed, impulsive, and not fully in control of her actions when she fired the gun. But when testimony revealed that her child had been present and directly witnessed the killing, the courtroom shifted. Jurors heard the chilling details of how a young life was scarred forever in those few seconds. The prosecution repeated one phrase again and again: "No child should ever see this." That point became central to the case. In the end, The jury was unconvinced by the defense. Katrina Culberson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many in the community, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but it also left behind a haunting image. A child forced to grow up with the memory of watching their parent kill the other. The media covered the story closely, highlighting both the violence of the crime and the devastating impact on children who grow up in volatile homes. Commentators pointed to Katrina's case as another reminder of how quickly domestic disputes can escalate to deadly consequences. Katrina's story stands as a sobering example of rage overtaking reason, leaving families shattered in a matter of seconds. The violence that erupted inside her home didn't just end a life. It destroyed the foundation of her child's future as well. But as shocking as this case was, it was not the last time America would be confronted with a crime committed by a woman that defied comprehension. While Katrina's crime was born out of rage, another woman's actions would horrify the nation for an entirely different reason. Not anger, but the desperate theft of motherhood itself. Julie Corey's story begins in Massachusetts, where her life had been marked not by stability, but by a long chain of personal struggles and failed relationships. Friends and acquaintances described her as a woman constantly searching for something to anchor herself. Someone who wanted desperately to project the image of a normal family life, but could never hold on to it. Her childhood had not been easy, and as she grew older, instability seemed to follow her. By her late 20s, Corey's personal history included broken romances, financial troubles, and a reputation for erratic behavior. She was a woman caught in a cycle of wanting more than her circumstances allowed, and that longing became her defining trait. Among the things she wanted most was motherhood. To those around her, Corey spoke often about having children, about wanting to raise a family, and about the deep satisfaction she believed it would bring her. She craved not only the role of a mother, but also the validation and respect that she thought came with it. But for Corey, this dream had been met with repeated disappointment. She had suffered multiple pregnancy losses, experiences that shook her emotionally and left scars that never seemed to heal. Each loss only magnified her obsession, turning a natural desire into something far darker and more consuming. At the same time, Corey was entangled in a relationship that carried its own kind of pressure. She had a boyfriend who expected commitment and stability, and she felt the weight of needing to secure her place in his life. To her, having a child was not just about fulfilling a personal dream, but also about cementing the relationship. The desire to be seen as a partner and as a mother blended together, creating a relentless drive that made her increasingly unstable. Friends noticed her mood swings, her tendency to exaggerate, and her growing desperation to prove she could live the life she imagined. As months passed, Corey began to blur the line between reality and fabrication. At one point, she even claimed to be pregnant when she wasn't, a lie that revealed just how far she was willing to go to present herself as the woman she wanted to be. The image of a happy, expectant mother became something she clung to, regardless of the truth. Her longing for motherhood had transformed into an obsession. And it was this obsession that would soon steer her into decisions that defied morality and shocked an entire community. Julie Corey's world was unstable, fragile, and defined by unmet desires. And as those desires grew more desperate, they set her on a path that no one around her could have anticipated. She was about to cross a line that would turn longing into violence and obsession into tragedy. Her desperation would soon collide with the life of another expectant mother, and the consequences would be horrific. In Worcester, Massachusetts, during the summer of 2009, Julie Corey's life intersected with that of 23-year-old Darlene Haynes. Darlene was known to her neighbors and friends as a kind young woman who, despite challenges, looked forward to the birth of her child. At the time, she was several months pregnant, and like many expectant mothers, she often shared her hopes, her anxieties, and her excitement about the life ahead. To outsiders, she seemed vulnerable, yet optimistic. Someone trying to carve out a stable future for her baby. Julie Corey saw in Darlene both an opportunity and a mirror. For Corey, who longed for motherhood but had suffered multiple pregnancy losses, being around a pregnant woman intensified her obsession. She gravitated toward Darlene, gradually inserting herself into her life. To Darlene, Julie appeared as a supportive acquaintance, someone who listened and offered companionship during what could be an isolating time. Julie's presence was not forced. She made it seem natural, friendly, and helpful. As their bond grew, Corey positioned herself as a figure of support. She visited Darlene, spent time with her, and cultivated a relationship that, on the surface, seemed rooted in shared experience. Julie often spoke of her own supposed pregnancy, presenting herself as someone who understood what Darlene was going through. In reality, Corey was not expecting a child, but the lie reinforced her image as a trustworthy confidant. The two women, both navigating complicated personal lives, leaned on each other in different ways. Darlene had her own struggles, including difficulties in her relationships and the stress of preparing to raise a child largely on her own. Having someone who appeared to empathize with her situation was a comfort. What she did not realize was that behind Corey's sympathetic facade lay a dangerous fixation. Each interaction brought Corey closer to her ultimate goal, and each step of trust Darlene offered unknowingly placed her in greater jeopardy. The deception deepened as Corey continued to tell others that she, too, was pregnant. She shaped her identity around this falsehood, convincing those around her, including her boyfriend, that she was expecting. The lie was not just a passing story. It was central to the persona she was building. Corey needed people to believe she was a mother-to-be, and in her mind, that belief demanded proof. Being close to Darlene gave her access to a chilling possibility, taking the child she could not have herself. By July 2009, Corey's plan was forming, though no one around her suspected it. She continued visiting Darlene, embedding herself in the younger woman's daily life. Friends later recalled how Corey seemed unusually attentive, always wanting to know about Darlene's progress and circumstances. To Darlene, this attention seemed harmless, perhaps even kind. But to Corey, each interaction was a step closer to executing a plan that had been born out of desperation and hardened by obsession. The tension between reality and deception tightened as the days passed. Corey's lies about her pregnancy had reached a point where she would soon be forced to produce evidence. A child. And, with Darlene approaching her due date, Corey's fixation grew sharper. The innocent trust between the two women created the perfect opening for what would become an unthinkable act. The bond of trust, nurtured under the pretense of friendship and shared motherhood, was on the brink of collapse. What began as companionship would soon turn into betrayal of the most brutal kind. Julie Corey was preparing to take what she wanted, and Darlene Haynes would pay the ultimate price. On the morning of July 23, 2009, the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, carried on like any other summer day. But inside a small apartment on Southgate Street, events unfolded that would shock the nation and leave investigators struggling to comprehend the brutality. At the center of it all were two women. one heavily pregnant and hopeful, the other desperate, unstable, and prepared to commit an act beyond imagination. Julie Corey, who had long pretended to be pregnant, saw her chance to solidify her lies. She had befriended 23-year-old Darlene Haynes, who was just days away from giving birth. On that fateful day, Julie visited Darlene's apartment under the guise of friendship. To neighbors, it looked like nothing more than two women spending time together. But behind closed doors, the situation quickly spiraled into something horrific. Investigators would later piece together the timeline. At some point during the visit, a confrontation began. Darlene, heavily pregnant and vulnerable, likely had little ability to defend herself. Julie's plan, to steal the unborn baby she had long claimed as her own, was already set in motion. In a sudden eruption of violence, Julie attacked Darlene. The cause of death would later be determined as strangulation. The brutality of that act alone painted a terrifying picture of Julie's desperation and determination. But what followed pushed the crime into almost unthinkable territory. After ending Darlene's life, Julie took a knife and performed a crude and violent cesarean section, cutting into Darlene's womb to extract the infant. The baby girl, only days from natural delivery, was torn from her mother's body in a setting that should have been filled with joy and anticipation. Darlene's life ended in unimaginable pain, while her newborn was ripped from the very place she was supposed to be safest. The aftermath inside the apartment was chilling. Darlene's body was stuffed into a closet, hidden under blankets in a desperate attempt to delay discovery. This shocking concealment, investigators later said, reflected Julie's sole focus, escaping with the child and presenting her as her own. The crime scene, when uncovered, horrified even veteran officers. It was not just a murder, it was mutilation, a desecration of both life and motherhood. While Darlene's body lay lifeless in her apartment, Julie left with the newborn in her arms. Instead of hiding in fear, she made a disturbing choice. That very same day, she appeared at a party, introducing the baby as her own daughter. Witnesses later testified that Julie seemed proud, even radiant, parading the infant as proof of her supposed pregnancy. In reality, the newborn's mother had been killed only hours earlier. The audacity of Julie's behavior was shocking. Guests at the gathering noticed inconsistencies, however. Some questioned how Julie could have given birth so suddenly without anyone knowing. Others wondered why she looked so composed for a woman who had just delivered a baby. Whispers of suspicion began, though no one could have imagined the horrifying truth that would soon come to light. Meanwhile, Darlene's absence was noted. Friends and neighbors who had expected to see her in the final days of her pregnancy grew worried. When they entered her apartment days later, the grim discovery was made. Darlene's decomposing body was found in the closet, wrapped in blankets. The heat of July had accelerated the process, making the scene even more disturbing. The details shocked the community and quickly drew media attention. At the same time, police began questioning Julie Corey. She had presented the newborn as her own child, but inconsistencies mounted. Her medical history did not align with a recent birth, and physical examinations revealed she had not been pregnant. The baby's identity became the focus. Investigators obtained DNA samples, which confirmed what they had begun to suspect. The infant was not Julie's child. She was the daughter of the murdered Darlene Haynes. The revelation was staggering. In the span of days, Julie Corey had transformed from a grieving mother figure in the eyes of some to a prime suspect in one of the most disturbing murders in Massachusetts history. Detectives described the case as unlike anything they had seen before. Not only a homicide, but a theft of life in its most literal sense. Julie's actions shocked her community, but they also ignited national media coverage. Stories of infant abductions, though rare, had always carried a chilling effect on the public. This case stood out not only for its brutality, but for the brazen way Julie attempted to pass the stolen baby off as her own. The charade did not last long. Once DNA evidence linked the child to Darlene, Julie was arrested and charged with murder. Her carefully constructed lies had unraveled, replaced by the undeniable truth of her crime. The horrifying murder and abduction left investigators, family, and community members reeling. But if the crime itself shocked the nation, the courtroom drama that followed would expose Julie Corey's twisted motives in even greater detail and determine her fate once and for all. Julie Corey's arrest in 2009 led to one of the most chilling trials Massachusetts had seen in decades. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case, presenting Julie not as a woman overwhelmed by emotion, but as a calculating killer who had plotted Darlene Haynes' death. They emphasized the brutality of the crime. Darlene had been strangled, her unborn child cut from her womb, and her body stuffed into a closet. The prosecution argued this was not a moment of panic. It was a deliberate plan executed to satisfy Corey's obsession with becoming a mother. The defense, in contrast, sought to frame Julie as a woman spiraling out of control. They painted her as mentally unstable, a person who had suffered multiple pregnancy losses and was consumed by emotional collapse. They argued she was not thinking rationally, but acting out of psychological desperation. The defense leaned heavily on her history of instability, hoping to soften the jury's perception of intent. But the testimony struck the courtroom hard. Witnesses recounted how Julie had attended a party with the newborn, proudly showing the child as if she had given birth herself. This detail alone became one of the most damning pieces of evidence, demonstrating premeditation rather than confusion. Jurors were also deeply shaken by the reminder that the victim's body had been hidden away while Julie celebrated with the infant. When the verdict was read, there was little surprise. Julie Corey was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the court's conclusion. This was not a crime of passion, but one of cold calculation. The case reverberated far beyond Worcester. News outlets across the nation covered the details, often describing it as one of the most disturbing female crimes in U.S. history. The public struggled to comprehend how the longing for motherhood could escalate into such horror. For Darlene's family, the trial provided justice, but it could never erase the pain of losing both a loved one and the innocence of the newborn's early life. Julie Corey's story became a grim reminder of how obsession, when unchecked, can destroy not just one life, but entire families. From Corey's shocking crime, the next case reveals another chilling story, where love itself became the weapon. Emilia Lily Carr, love turned fatal. Emilia Lily Carr's case exposed how toxic relationships can spiral into deadly consequences. She was young, full of dreams, but became trapped in a relationship marked by jealousy, manipulation, and control. Her boyfriend's obsession crossed every boundary, turning into violence. Friends had seen the arguments, the pressure, and the emotional abuse, but nobody imagined it would end with her life being taken. Emilia's murder became a harsh reminder that ignoring red flags in relationships can cost everything. Katrina Marie Culberson. Katrina Marie Culberson's story revealed another dark side of unstable love. What began as romance turned into chaos. Constant fights, emotional instability, and an inability to let go. Neighbors could hear the shouting, but no one could predict how far things would go. One night, years of anger and frustration exploded into a crime that shocked those around her. Katrina crossed the line from conflict to destruction, and her case showed how volatile relationships can destroy not just one life, but entire families. Julie Corey. The most disturbing case came from Julie Corey. Unlike the others, hers was not about jealousy or rage, but about a terrifying form of obsession. Julie had long dreamed of being a mother, but after failed pregnancies, her desperation consumed her. She told everyone she was pregnant, even when she wasn't. To keep her lie alive, she targeted Darlene Haynes, a young woman who was 8 months pregnant. On July 23, 2009, Julie strangled her and cut the baby from her womb. Hours later, she carried the newborn to a party, presenting the child as her own. The crime shocked the nation, leaving even investigators stunned at the brutality. When looking at these 3 cases together, a chilling pattern appears. Each story is different, one about a toxic romance, one about uncontrollable rage, and one about obsessive desperation. Yet all 3 share the same theme: love twisted into something dark and destructive. Whether it was control, instability, or obsession, the result was the same. Innocent lives were stolen. Media coverage of these crimes brought national attention, not only because of their brutality, but because they showed sides of female violence rarely discussed. Society often imagines women as nurturers, caregivers, or victims. But Emilia, Katrina, and Julie's cases proved that women, too, can commit horrific crimes when driven by obsession, rage, or desperation. Communities were left horrified, asking how these tragedies could have been prevented. From these cases, one truth becomes clear: dangerous behavior rarely comes without warning signs. Toxic control, violent fights, or unhealthy obsessions, they all leave clues. When ignored, those signs grow until they explode into irreversible tragedy. Emilia's life was lost to jealousy, Katrina's to rage, and Darlene's to Julie's horrific obsession. 3 different stories, one devastating reality. In the end, these cases are more than just shocking headlines. They are reminders of how fragile human lives are when love is poisoned by darkness. They warn us about the dangers of ignoring emotional abuse, underestimating rage, and failing to see how far desperation can push someone. Emilia Lily Carr, Katrina Marie Culberson, and Darlene Haynes. 3 names that should never be forgotten, because their stories show how quickly love can transform into horror.